movement. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Svetlana to ask her to introduce herself, please.
Hi everyone, it's really great to be here and thank you so much, Leon. I'm Svetlana. I'm a trustee at Culture And, which is a charity that is dedicated to diversifying the workforce in the arts and culture sector. I've been on the board for 7 months now and it's my first trustee experience, so I'm very much new to all of this, but it's been really great and an amazing experience so far. I'm also a London champion for the Young Trustees movement. And I've been working with the team on an online group for aspiring trustees. If there are any trustees on the line with us this evening, please do check out the Digital Hub and join us for some upcoming sessions that we're going to have online in the coming week.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure about everybody else's, but I think Zoom is playing up slightly this evening, but we'll carry on as normal. I heard just about everything. It was a bit jumpy in parts. So I'm going to kick off with the big question, Svetlana. Can you talk to us about what's been happening in your boardroom during coronavirus?
Yeah, so in the boardroom, there's been a lot of planning around how we manage the crisis. We have had to furlough some of our staff, which is obviously a really difficult decision to take. And we're really trying to plan strategically now about how the coming months will sort of look and pan out and how also we can sort of bring our staff back.
And how many of the staff have you furloughed, just as a percentage? Or
quite a small percent.
Just give us a figure of how many staff have been furloughed.
Yeah, so just about 5, like a handful of staff have been furloughed. So it's not a lot because we are quite a small team, but it was still obviously really difficult to do as all of our staff are really valuable to, you know, our success as a company.
I think it's quite interesting because furloughing, I've seen some charities say they're going to absolutely try and resist furloughing as much as they can. But I think it's about business continuity, right? And actually, when we come back to normal life, I wouldn't be surprised if some funders turned around to charities and said, what did you do to cut costs at a time when the world was in crisis? So not only does it keep cash in the bank, but I think it sends the right message to funders. And you're a culture organisation, so are your funders public sector or is it a mixture of trusts and foundations, etc.?
Most of our funders are public sector. So we have relied on them quite heavily sort of throughout the years. And I think the challenge that we're facing at the moment, because they are sort of public sector funding. Hello?
Hi, I'm still here.
Okay, sorry, I thought you were gone. Because all of our funders are sort of public sector, that's meant for us that a lot of the grants that we're planning to apply to for funding sort of 2-3 years down the line are now paused, and they've sort of been reallocated obviously to emergency coronavirus funding. So that sort of really shifted the game for us, and that's why we sort of have to think strategically now about what our finances look like in the coming 6 months to 12 months.
And how did you go about communicating the decision to the person you were furloughing or the people that you were furloughing and to the rest of the team?
So we obviously had a conversation with the staff members that we decided to furlough, and then we sort of communicated that internally to the full team and obviously the board as well. But we didn't really go about communicating that so much externally. If we had a few questions and queries from, you know, sort of outside sources, we would just let them know the situation and that, you know, that particular employee or employees had been furloughed, but we didn't actually go actively out there sort of to message that. And I think it's because, you know, there are a bit of sensitivities around furlough at the moment, and it's quite a balancing act between trying to ensure that, you know, the public image of the organization is maintained as positive and also viable during this really difficult situation, and also thinking about how furlough affects, you know, staff in terms of their you know, in terms of their sort of motivation. You know, how do we manage that? How do we sort of give them the reassurance that they need that this is sort of a temporary fix to, you know, a longer term difficulty.
Mm. And let's just kind of delve into that a little bit more then, because obviously you're, well, we're all now several weeks into having furloughed and into the virus impacting. Is there any learning that you would reflect back on with the power of hindsight? And I know that whenever we look back at things that we've done, we're always thinking, oh, well, had I known X, Y, and Z, I would have done things differently. Clearly, that's not the case. But now you've got that knowledge, what is it that you would either coach yourself or your board to do differently when dealing with this?
I think if we had to look back on it, I would say that the work that we're doing now in terms of building our strategy, our short-term and long-term strategy, and sort of working on that and adapting it to what we're currently facing, we probably should have done a bit sooner. Obviously, we had to make sort of decisions in the moment and had to be quite reactionary at the time because, as we all know, the situation is so fluid and constantly changing. So I think we obviously did the best that we could in that moment. But I think if we had the chance to go back, it would be really thinking strategically about what our plans were around furlough, around financing, and how, you know, we were really going to navigate that. Because obviously, as everyone's experiencing, is how do we then get our staff back? How do we wean ourselves off of the furlough scheme and all of these different things that we're really trying to pin down at the moment?
And what about trustee well-being and all of this? Because something that I know that the private sector in particular, and even some questionable politicians online, have said things like, if you don't come out of this having learned a new language, then something's wrong with you. What is it? So there's something there about the pressure to be productive, despite the fact that A, our entire working lives have changed, and B, our personal lives have changed too. And everyone is working at home, and some people have lovely, great big houses to work from. Other people don't have that. I'm currently sat at my kitchen table, albeit a fairly nice corner of the kitchen, because if I twist my camera slightly, you see the sink, but I've turned my video off to help my internet bandwidth. But there's something there about trustee well-being. Have you got any sort of top tips about how you've managed that? I guess the starting place would be, first of all, have you felt stressed out about this a little bit as a trustee?
Yes, I mean, definitely. I think in sort of my personal life, I've been furloughed as well. So for me, it's been about trying to navigate that whilst also being a trustee and having all of those responsibilities. And then also, as you said, you know, thinking about well-being. For me, it hasn't been about being the most productive. It's just been about trying to get through day by day. And I think if you take things sort of one day at a time and allow yourself the time to sort of just come to terms with everything that we're going through. I think, you know, so many people have experienced really so much hardship during the last couple of months. And I think it's really important to be kind to yourself and really just think about how, you know, what works best for you. You know, how can you alleviate some of the stress or anxiety that you may be feeling? So for me, it was, you know, taking a walk, cooking, doing a bit more volunteering like I've been doing for the Young Trustees movement to sort of fill the hours in my now empty day. So I think that would be sort of my advice to other young trustees. You know, don't be too hard on yourself, take things day by day and really just find the things that make you happy and help you cope through all of this difficulty.
And that's all great advice, but what has been guiding you in your decision making around your response to the virus? Has there been anything that you've read, or are you just doing what everyone else is doing and trying to make heads or tails of the news cycle as it comes in and tells you what the government intends to do?
I think it's a bit of both. It's a bit about using your sort of like own common sense and doing the things that make you feel safe. I know personally for me, it's going outside wearing a mask. Other people may not want to do that. But again, you know, it's just finding what works best for you. And obviously listening to the government guidelines as well in terms of what they are advising us all to do.
But what about in your decision making, like as a trustee? So deciding to furlough and things, obviously that happened quite quickly, all the information around furloughing. We're getting more information now about what might happen with the extended period, i.e. some employees have to contribute, etc. But who's been guiding you as the board, or have you been, like I say, doing what most people have been doing and just sort of mingling their way through the detail as it comes out?
I think for us, the decision making has sort of been guided by the fact that we are really committed to bringing our staff back as soon as possible. So we have not only, obviously we've implemented the furlough scheme, but we've also tried to make cuts at sort of every level that we could, getting sort of a rent reduction because obviously we're not in the office right now. Looking at how we can sort of cut costs in terms of, you know, the photocopier, the telephone, and like all of these, just these smaller things to really sort of make cuts and then help us in sort of getting back on track in terms of bringing our staff back, and also at the same time still applying for grants and trying to get through the funding process as we go along.
And I mean, I think that's one of the, we'll talk about funding in a second, but I think that's, for me, this whole situation has been a bit of a playing field leveler. I think I said that in the last webinar we had with some of the people who are watching now. But I think, like, look, no trustee has ever experienced anything like this before. So for once, young trustees can be in the process of making decisions about something nobody knows anything about. So what I mean is that despite skills and age differences and experience in your day jobs, actually this has leveled the playing field for all of us. We've all been finding our way, and I found on my board it's been a really good time for us to rise to the challenge as a team and to come through this sort of coordinated and make allowance for the fact that everyone is learning at the same time. Now, you said something there that was interesting, that you're still applying for grants and trying to seek extra support. I think this has shown massive gaps in charity funding and the funding model that charities have. What are your thoughts about all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think, you know, for us at Culture, and it has sort of shone a spotlight on the fact that we are so reliant on grants and public funding. And it's really hopefully going to give us an opportunity to think about how we can diversify our income streams and think about other ways of bringing in funding and making sure that we're sustainable to run all of the public programs that we are currently doing. So I think that's going to be a real challenge, but also hopefully the pandemic offers that sort of time to think about how else we can be doing things differently and bringing in other sources of income.
And don't you think that one thing in this that I think it's exposed is that trust foundations and even the public sector, when giving grants to charities, hold such stringent conditions that it's meant a lot of charities haven't been prepared or better prepared to fight the virus. So an example is lots of trusts and foundations won't support charities that have big reserves because they think you should be spending those reserves instead of going after new pots of funding. But clearly during now, whilst everyone's income has dried up, or just about everyone's income has dried up, the first place you look to are your reserves. But loads of charities only have 2-3 months at best because their funders have told them not to build them up. Do you think that after this, that might change?
I think definitely something is going to have to change in terms of how funding is allocated and what the criteria is for that as well. I think hopefully this will be a chance for charities to really look at their models and their pots and say, okay, you know, we do need to have a lot more in reserve in case there is, you know, another sort of crisis like this that we will have to face in the coming years.
Mm. And I think, like, as a sector, we sort of need to find our voice really around pushing funders to do things differently, to allow us to build up reserves so that we can continue to operate should anything like this hit again, especially if we're going, from what I understand, a sort of flux system between lockdown and freedom, because that means that your income patterns are going to change, and so will your expenditure patterns. Now, there's something you said at the beginning, which I haven't picked up on yet, but I really want to, which is that you've been a trustee for, is it 7 months?
Yeah.
So, you know, you've been a trustee at sort of probably the worst time in most charities' history. How have you found joining a board digitally and not being in the room with the people that you would otherwise be working with?
I've actually not found it too bad at all. I think because our board is quite small, it's worked really well on Zoom actually, because you can sort of see all of the faces because it's just a couple of us, and we've all been able to talk quite freely and easily about the, you know, the different documents and all of the different challenges that we're having at the moment. So it's worked quite well. But again, we've only done one digitally so far. So I think in a couple of weeks' time when we meet again, we'll see, you know, how that goes.
Great. And did they still induct you properly? Have you had a trustee induction over Zoom?
Yeah, so I was inducted last year. So we did have a board meeting at the end of last year. So that's, yeah, when I did my induction.
Okay, so you were still thrown into the deep end, but at least you had a slight induction. I mean, it does help, doesn't it, around like just understanding the history in the room, getting to grips with the organisation, and then moving into this period.
Exactly. And I think the chair was really supportive as well with me at the beginning.
So I'm going to turn my video off again because I think it's, I don't know if it's my internet or others that's causing this, but hopefully we will still be able to continue. We received a question on the hub. I don't know who asked it because I've not been told, but the question is, considering trustees have legal responsibility, are there any steps that an aspiring trustee can take before and during an application to get an understanding of how the board have been managing the crisis to ensure the organisation is viable? Any top tips?
Yeah, I think I'd always say before starting any application would be to do your research. You know, there's so much information available online in terms of records for the organization. I would suggest sort of having a look to see if they've had any sort of news coverage around them about during the current pandemic, if there's sort of anything that's been covered in the press to give you a sort of insight into what's happening in the organization. I think if the application allows for you to have an informal conversation with someone, that would be a really good opportunity to set that up, talk to them, and maybe, you know, ask those questions. I think it's such obviously an exceptional circumstance that you are sort of allowed to ask, you know, well, what is my liability if I were to join this board? Obviously, different organizations are set up in different ways. So I think it's only fair enough that they're allowed to ask that question. I think also even just asking, you know, informally as well, whether, you know, how things are looking, if there are any challenges that the board has been facing financially, you know, what they might be doing to sort of get themselves out of that situation if the answer was yes. And then I think if in the next step in terms of if the person was offered an interview and made it to the interview stage, I think that's also an opportunity to ask those questions again if that wasn't an option available at the beginning of the application process, to speak to someone informally. I think sort of asking it as one of your follow-up questions in the interview stage would also just make you look like, you know, you're really sort of ready to take on that board role and that you're thinking really critically and strategically about what the needs of the organization is. I think that would only be to that person's benefit to ask. I don't know if you had anything else to add, Leon, as I know you have many more years experience.
Well, yeah, but it's been a while since I joined a board. So it's been a while since I did any of that due diligence. I think everything you said there was spot on. I think asking difficult questions at each stage shows you to be a diligent and proper trustee, and also someone who is almost, you know, trained to be on the board. I would get confidence from somebody asking questions like that. I would say I would perhaps even go a step further up and asking for up-to-date sort of management accounts and the finance numbers, just so I can get my head around what's happening right now. I think lots of charities will be unwilling to be forthright with that, but I think that perhaps tells you a lot about whether you should apply for that organisation or not. I guess it depends on your risk factor. One thing I would say as well is that legal responsibility terrifies lots of potential trustees, but most charities are also companies that are limited by guarantee. Now, what that means is, and you can find this out by either looking at the bottom of a charity website where it says company limited by guarantee, or have a look on Companies House website, because if a charity is limited by guarantee, then that means trustees are liable for a teeny tiny sum, normally less than £10. The average is less than £10. So should it ever go bust, that is what you could end up potentially paying. Now, I know that doesn't mean you won't join a board and make difficult decisions. Of course, that could be still something that is part of the role, but don't be put off by applying for things because you think you're going to be thrown in front of a judge. The reality is that if you act with, in the best interest of the charity, and that you do a diligent job and you don't do anything illegal and you ask the right questions, you will largely be protected from the courts should it ever get to that stage. And actually, having now just spoken about that, was that something you had considered before you applied, Svetlana? Were you concerned about legal responsibility or anything?
No, actually, it wasn't something that I had been concerned about, but it is something that came up in our last board meeting, actually, and we thought that we should actually look back at the memorandum for the organization and just triple check and make sure that everyone had all of the relevant information, because obviously different people joined the board at different times, and I was the last person to join the board. So I think it was really good to just refresh ourselves on what our liability was. And as you mentioned, yeah, for us, it would be £1, you know, should things go the other way.
Well, it's good to see that what I'm saying is real. Like people's lives, right? Because once you see that, it does lift a big weight from your shoulders. So now let's just shift the conversation on slightly, because I still want to talk about the virus, but I want to talk about it as the context setter. So have you got any tips for anyone on the call or anyone watching after who wants to raise the topic of young trusteeship, but feels like now isn't the right time to do it? Because clearly there'll be lots of people that want to have conversations with charities they're involved in who want to talk about young trusteeship, but it might seem a bit minute during the crisis. Any tips?
I think my one tip would probably be to approach it from a volunteering aspect. Obviously, you know, trusteeship is a form of volunteering as well. But I think look at it as what skills do I have that I can offer? You know, is there something that I'm particularly interested in this one charity in my local neighborhood? Obviously, I know it's really a difficult time for them, but maybe I can offer, some of my time over the next coming months to help volunteer and support them, and offer some of my skills. And I think having that sort of initial opportunity to volunteer and help would then sort of lay a nice foundation for talking about trusteeship once things have settled a bit.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And actually, there's some research out there that's showing that diversity has been placed on the back burner throughout all of this. So I think this is about still maintaining your values and being true to your values, despite what's going on outside the four walls of your home. And I think that once this blows over slash calms down, we will remember those people that were asking difficult questions about things like diversity after this, because it's too important to let go. And actually, I would argue that charities would be better equipped with handling this had they had more diverse trustees on their board. Now, clearly, it's an extreme set of circumstances, but I do strongly believe that diverse decision-making is always better decision-making, even if it's not easier. Now, we spoke earlier about furloughing and the process that you've gone through that, and I think that's one of the easiest examples for people to grasp when talking about the virus and the impact on working life. Has going through that process changed the relationship between your staff that are not furloughed and your trustees?
Yes, I think for us, it has a bit, in terms of we are sort of working more closely together than we would have normally, as we sort of really reliant on the staff that are still there to sort of be putting through the grant applications, to be sort of looking at the finances quite critically. And, we are sort of working together even more than we normally would have, because obviously we're trying to work through this really difficult period. So I think that is a positive though, because, we are having the opportunity to have some really good conversations and really see all of the great work that some of our staff are doing, and just making sure that they are seeing everything sort of ticking over nicely during these really difficult months, and just seeing all of the hard work that they've been doing.
Yeah, I think that's really good to hear. And what about then talking about Wellbeing again, which we spoke about earlier? How have you as a trustee encouraged your staff at your organisation to manage their own well-being?
It's not something that we've sort of looked at quite in depth at the moment, but we are sort of managing it in terms of workload. So in our last meeting, we're sort of managing things, because the challenge with furlough is that the staff who are still working means that they take on a lot more and take on the workload of the staff that we've had to put on leave. So that means their workload has increased, the pressure has increased, and they're obviously doing their best. So I think for us, it's really just about sort of managing that increased workload and just sort of, setting more realistic deadlines for things, and sort of having that understanding that we are sort of operating with less staff.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much more you can do really other than keeping the communication channels open. I think you just have to be reactive and responsive at the right time. So considering you've been in the role for 7 months, you've been hit with the crisis, and you furloughed some of your staff. You've been dealing with that whilst on furlough yourself. That's a lot to go through in your first year as a trustee. What would be your top tips to anyone that's watching this who is about to start a trustee role?
I think my top tips would be, don't be afraid to ask a question. And really, if you're not sure about something, if you're sort of looking at the documents or looking at the numbers and thinking, something isn't quite right here, don't be afraid to speak up. I think, it is, obviously we've said it so many times, but it is a really difficult time, and we're all dealing with so many things personally and trying to sort of cope through this difficult time. So I think it is about making sure that you're vocal about your queries, because during such a challenging period, there is so much room for human error. And so it's really important that, if you spot something in the documents, that you speak up, you say, what about this? Have we sort of looked at this? And really bring your ideas to the fore. I think it is an opportunity for new trustees to boards to really sort of own their place in the group as well, and really contribute to sort of building the dynamic and even changing it during this current situation. I think that's something that I found recently as well, was, I was sort of looking at the documents again and I wasn't sure about something, and I did ask, and then it sort of turned out that it was an error and we were able to fix it right away. So I think don't underestimate the value that you can bring to asking a question.
Great, and I think that's all great top tips. And I just think, the last one I would add in there is don't worry if it doesn't go completely how you were expecting it to in your first, as your first trusteeship, because these are weird times that we live in, and we're probably not out of the woods yet. Now, you mentioned earlier about volunteering, and that trusteeship is a type of volunteering, and I just wondered, I know that you've relocated to this country. How many years ago was it? 7 years ago. 7 years ago, and that you've been a trustee for 7 months, so 7 is your lucky number. But what would you say, is the number one, or kind of your top 2 benefits that you've gotten out of being a trustee so far? And just before you answer, just a reminder to everyone watching, if you want to ask a question, please just say you have a question to ask in the chat and I'll bring you in. If you have a question that you want us to ask, then just type the question in the chat. So yes, Svetlana, back to the question. What has trusteeship sort of done for you? What are the top 2 things that you've loved about it?
I think for me, the first one would be, I have also sort of been really passionate about diversity and trying to bring different voices into the fore. And I think being on the board for an organization that champions that has really been an incredible opportunity. I think for me, I work in the art sector as well, and I do see the need for so many more diverse voices coming through, and I'm really glad that I'm part of a team that sort of champions that and is working to sort of give young people opportunities to have employment within the sectors. I'm really pleased about that. I think the second thing is being part of a team of really experienced people. I think, for instance, the CEO of Culture, and he's so experienced, he's done such great work in the sector, and it's really I think a real pleasure to learn from these people and really sort of build your skills as well, not only as a young trustee but as a young professional.
Okay, so flipping the coin, what's been the worst thing?
Hard. I think the worst thing is probably trying to navigate the furlough situation and how we do the balancing act between viability and trying to bring staff back has been really tough.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's hard, isn't it? You have to show you're open for business, but also show that you're taking the right steps to protect the business in the long term. So I think that's really helpful. And thanks for being so honest there. We've got two people that want to ask questions. So I'm going to bring Anthony Wheeler in first. Anthony, you can start your video if you like. I'm going to unmute you as well, ready to ask your question.
That's fine. Hi, Svetlana. So my question, and I think you and Leon both touched on this in your talk, you were talking a little bit about kind of trustee welfare and kind of looking out for people. And you mentioned that trustees have lots of competing priorities. And I was just wondering if on your board, you've had a situation where, you know, actually being a trustee might be at the bottom of someone's priority when they're kind of taking on extra responsibilities for someone in their work. They might be juggling childcare, they might be juggling caring responsibilities, and kind of having all of that in one time. Is there any way that your board has adjusted their practices to kind of suiting the needs of a trustee board that might not actually be able to operate at full capacity? Kind of changing the way that you present information, changing the way your documents happen, and kind of lending a supportive ear, I guess, in a way that your board normally wouldn't.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think what's changed for us is that because the situation is so critical, we've decided to have more regular meetings. Obviously, we used to meet quarterly, but because we really need to sort of get our strategy in place, we've decided to meet about every 3 weeks now to just have a look at the finances, you know, regroup and really just discuss things together. Not that I'm aware, we haven't had any of our board members have any sort of competing difficulties in terms of childcare and sort of managing the trustee role, but a few members didn't join the last meeting, so perhaps they did have, you know, conflicting appointments as well. So I think we've sort of put the times of the meetings to be sort of in the evening. So again, if anyone has, you know, sort of work commitments during the day, they can then join us in the evening. In terms of the documents, everything obviously now is all online, which I think works much better for me. That means we're not printing things out and wasting paper. And I think for me, it was almost easier having all of the figures sort of on the screen and you're literally going through line by line, okay, this is what this is. And I think it just allows you to pay a bit more attention to sort of each section and going through things a bit more thoroughly, actually. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks for that. It was a great question and great answer as well. I don't have anything to add, which is quite unusual, as people watching this will know. But Megan, I know you have a question.
I do. Hi. I've been nodding along furiously to everything you've been saying, particularly around your values and things like that. It's actually a question that you both might be able to answer. So I know that you both are trustees for different size charities, and I was wondering if you thought that the COVID crisis was impacting differently for small charities, and trustees were having to respond differently depending on the size of the charity.
Good question. Svetlana, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Meg. I think for us, what we found, again, going back to funding and grants, we found that because we're a smaller organization, we're actually not eligible for some grants as they are more suited for bigger organizations. So that sort of limited what we can apply to. As I think that's, for me, the biggest way we've sort of seen the difference between the two.
I would say that the experience at Brook has been really interesting because in terms of numbers, we furloughed 1/3 of our staff, which is pretty significant for an organisation our size. We have some complexities because half of our organisation are healthcare staff because they're nurses in our clinics running the sexual health test that we run. And they can't be furloughed because they are paid for by public sector funding because councils contract them in. So that's been a real interesting kind of mind meddler to get your head around, which is that okay, we have these bunch of nurses that in some of our services can't operate digitally. You can give advice about sexual health digitally, but you can't test digitally. And you certainly can't prescribe digitally if you're a nurse. So if you think someone is describing chlamydia to you, for instance, you can't actually give them what they need to fix chlamydia. So that's been an interesting challenge for us, and I think has thrown up some really timely conversations about the digitization of healthcare, which really is fascinating. I mean, it's a fascinating conversation to be had. The second is, I would say that around income, our income has largely maintained because, again, it's local authorities that contract us in. But we are on some of our contracts payments by results. So a local authority will only pay you if you test, I don't know, 100,000 people a day, shall we say, going with Boris's target. That clearly is not happening because we can't get people into the clinic. So it has impacted us quite severely. We have shifted the business a lot. You know, a third of our staff are furloughed. We don't know when this is going to end and when face-to-face healthcare can continue. But we know now that sexual health is more important than ever because you've got people locked down in all sorts of different situations. But trying to get people to think about that is really hard, considering the impact that the virus has had more widely. So, you know, we're a big charity and it's still difficult. Did you want to come back on that, Meg?
Yeah. Helpful. Sorry, yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
Okay, great. Okay, so we've got about 6 minutes left. One of the questions I wanted to carry on with a little bit when you were talking about, you know, trusteeship as a way of giving back, etc. Do you know if any of your staff are trustees as well?
That's a good question.
Of different organisations.
I actually don't know the answer to that, so I'm not sure.
Because there's something here about, you know, the role of charities in developing talent internally to go out and be trustees. And you work in the private sector, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, and you know, the charity sector is very good at saying to the private sector, you must give volunteering leave for your staff to come and be a trustee, etc. But often charities don't have that because they don't think that their staff are the sorts of people that would normally become trustees. Is there anything that you think your organisation could do to make it easier for your staff to become trustees?
That's a really good question. I think because we work with so many different national partners as part of sort of our New Museum School program, I think that staff are quite, you know, a big part of the sector and what we do, and they sort of see the opportunities that they are. I know someone who's just gone off on maternity leave. She's also just finishing off her PhD. So I think everyone is really invested in the sector that way. So I think it's perhaps more sort of a personal level, and I guess a time thing as well, whether they think that they have the time to sort of offer that on top of what, you know, all of their other commitments as well.
So, so to spin the mirror back to you, how are you finding the time to do it? Normally, obviously not while you're furloughed, because everyone has plenty of time whilst furloughed, but what's the situation with you and your work? Do you get volunteering leave or do you take annual leave for it, or how does that work?
No, so I don't get volunteering leave. So anything that I would do, I would have to take annual leave for. But again, I think for me, it's just, it was sort of trying to find the time and also finding the right opportunity. I knew I wanted to be a trustee for quite some time, but I hadn't really found anything that I was really interested in terms of the organization. And then I think once you find the opportunity, then somehow you make the time as well.
Yeah, people always ask me the question, how do you find the time? And I think you just kind of make the time. You put in everything you can to make it work, which isn't necessarily the right way to go about it, but it does mean that you are sitting in the boardroom and other people who aren't willing to make that sacrifice, right? And at least now you're in the boardroom, you can start pushing for things to happen differently. So are you recruited as a young trustee, or were they recruiting you for a specific skill set that you bring to the table? What was the sort of dynamic there?
It was my skill set. So I come from a cultural communications background, and they felt that that was something that the charity needed, was to have sort of a communications eye on everything. So that's why I was recruited.
And how old are you?
27.
27. Okay, so you're younger than me. You've been there. So were you, and when did you turn 27? Were you 26 when you were appointed, or have you been 27 the whole time at the trusteeship?
Right. Yeah, I was 26 when I was appointed, so I turned 27 this year.
Great. And are there any other young trustees on your board, or are you the only one?
Yeah, so there's one other young trustee. She's a lawyer. So again, I think they were sort of looking for skills that, you know, really just important skills to just help the charity and all of the operations.
Yeah, I mean, this is ace because people that are watching this might well be, who watch it later, might well be chief execs or chairs of charities wondering about young trustees and thinking, who the hell wants to be a young trustee? But now we've got two perfect examples of someone that's a communications expert and another who is a lawyer. Because one of the things that we find difficult, that and people in the movement have said this, is convincing people why you have to think about young trustees. And actually, it's one of the only categories of types of trustees that we have to convince people to do. So you coming to the situation with your skill set and your colleague coming as a lawyer is a great kind of, what am I saying, like a great symbol of what the movement actually really is. Is there anything that then, because you've been a trustee for 7 months, you've got a couple of young trustees, is there anything your board could do differently that would make it easier for you to be a trustee?
I think perhaps advertising when they are looking for new opportunities, making sure that the ads sort of reach the people that they're looking for, especially young people. I think, you know, there are sort of specific areas where people look for opportunities. So I think it's also about using the network. I think the charity has an excellent network of cultural partners. And I think that they should be sort of capitalizing that and using those partners a lot more so that when they are recruiting for trustees again, that they can sort of tap into those networks and those young people who are working for all of those organizations.
And where, just tell us where you found the advert. How did you find out about the opportunity?
So I actually, I got in touch with the team directly. So I actually didn't go through sort of the full application process. It was sort of, I was meeting them. And then I sort of had the opportunity to speak with the CEO, and he sort of mentioned that they had been looking for someone, they hadn't sort of advertised anything, but they were looking for someone with a communication skill set. So it was sort of perfect timing that I got in touch to say that I was interested in the work that they were doing at the time.
I think that's great, because actually I often tell young people to make direct contact, and lots of them are sort of nervous about doing that. But the worst that these people could do is say no or ignore you.
Yeah,
right?
I totally agree. And I think that's the second opportunity I've had where I've just sort of reached out, sent like one of those cold emails, and I actually heard something back. So I definitely recommend it. It happens sometimes. My current mentor as well, I sort of sent her an email. I was just so impressed with some of the work that she was doing for the sector. And I thought that I'd love to meet her for coffee. And she said yes. So I think, you know, there are those moments where people do want to support the sort of the personal and professional development of young people. So we shouldn't sort of be afraid of asking a question.
I think that's great, and really good that we ended that on that, because the next session next week is how to find trustee positions. So the fact you brought the conversation to that without knowing what next week is great. So thank you for that. And we're being joined by somebody called Renee Campbell, who's 21 and just found a trusteeship through the hub. So if you want to know anything about how to find trusteeship, then come and join us next week, same time, same place. So next Thursday from 6:30 till 7:15. This will be recorded again and uploaded to YouTube, and we will share an update in the digital hub for you all as well. But that leaves me to say thank you very much, Svetlana, for the last 45 minutes. It's been great hearing your experience, and I loved all the tips that you've given everyone. And thank you to everybody for joining us too, and for those of you that asked a question, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.